Content. We live in a time of content where content creators make content for us to engage with. But what makes content? That might be opening a rabbit hole that I'm not prepared to go down. So maybe a better question is this: what is entertaining? In other words, what could I remove from this video right now in order for it to still be entertaining? What if I removed the visuals? Or brought it back but removed the music? What if it was just a black screen with my own narration? Would that just be a podcast? Would that be better than a moving video with no sound? Obviously, what people find to be entertaining has changed dramatically throughout history, and the purpose of this intro is not to make any kind of grand statement about that, but rather a self-reflective exercise. Would you watch a video of a black screen? Do you need 2, maybe 3 split screens with various content happening to keep your eyes entertained? What do we engage with, and why do we engage with it in the ways that we do? This is different for every person, but generally people do have a preference. This is why when you're watching an adapted movie, you'll almost always hear someone pipe up and say, the book was better. What do people mean by this? Usually what they mean is that they felt that the different mediums served the story better. Maybe a book could be more fleshed out and detailed, giving more content to a person who appreciates its story or world. In some cases, movies can help a reader to visualize scenes or ideas that they wouldn't be able to quite grasp from the words on a page. Anyways, all of this is to say, next time you're watching Star Wars, I dare you to shout, "The radio dramas were better." Yes, although film had been around for decades at this point, one of the many ways that Star Wars had been adapted throughout the years came in the form of a series of radio dramas throughout the 80s and 90s. And while this may surprise you, what's even more surprising is to discover that these are not simply audio from the films or the script condensed into a digestible radio program. These are fully acted out with a brand new cast, besides a few familiar voices from the movies, with sound effects from the movies, and an original script adapted from the original movies. These scripts actually extend each of the films, rather than condense it, the longest one nearly 6 hours long. Star Wars as a franchise has so many iconic designs that it's hard to keep track of. Something interesting about the change in medium here is that listeners are able to strip all the visuals away and ask, is the actual story of Star Wars any good? Is it good enough to stand on its own? The radio dramas of the past were surely iconic, but we're in a time when Star Wars had completely blown audiences away with its universe and visual storytelling. How did these come to be? How were these made? How did any of this happen? Well, I do intend to answer these questions in this video, however, these are not the main purpose of the discussion for me. What I'm more focused on is using these radio dramas as one example in a discussion about any art that's adapted into a different form. In what ways do various mediums that art's adapted to change what it means or how we interact with it? Does any adapted work have a life of its own, or is it always in service of the original work? All that being said, let's try and wrap our heads around Star Wars radio dramas.
Now, here is a story on how the hit movie looks on radio.
It's taking stage with your voice, really. We talk to ourselves a lot more in the radio adaptation.
We were all walking way out on a plank, I think, keeping our fingers crossed.
By the time that the original Star Wars was released in 1977, radio dramas were already a thing of the past. By that time, color television and film were already immensely popular, and with Betamax and early VHS cassette tapes taking off at home, the ability to watch a film in the home completely destroyed any chances of radio shows lasting. The reality is that radio had become a dying art form long before home media had become popularized, as the ubiquity of television would be the final death blow in the 50s and early 60s. While radio dramas had had their time in the sun, being immensely popular, they too could not survive the death of radio. Jim Cox, a historian of radio, said this in his book, Say Goodnight Gracie, The Last Years of Network Radio. The soap operas, one of the most prolific and powerful forms of programming to go out across radio airwaves, finally reached an ultimate conclusion on November 25, 1960, when the remaining quartet of daytime dramas still airing were cancelled by CBS. In many ways, their abrupt departure signified the end of radio's golden age. Suddenly, these popular ongoing stories were brought to an untimely end, not because of the stories themselves, but the way in which they were being delivered. The truth of the matter is that by the 1960s, television was taking over. So, it's safe to say that in 1960, radio as a medium was dead, compared to how popular it had been in the decades prior. Of course, music would continue to air, but much like these soap operas or radio dramas died in November of 1960, so did the idea of them. So why then was the decision made to adapt Star Wars into a radio drama over 2 decades after the death of the radio drama? Much of what I will be discussing here comes from this great NPR radio piece and article from 2015 by Derek John, as well as A Brief Guide to Star Wars by Brian Robb. It's hard to pinpoint where exactly the story begins, but I would argue that it begins with two men, Richard Toscan and John Houseman. I bring up Houseman because he has been an integral part of radio drama history, with one of his most notable examples being producer of the Mercury Theatre Company during the controversial and influential War of the Worlds broadcast by Orson Welles. The production that reportedly, but didn't actually, sent America into a fit of chaos, as the story was presented as a series of interviews and news reports as opposed to a traditional form.
Ladies and gentlemen, am I on? Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, back of a stone wall that adjoins Mr. Wilmer's garden. Wait a minute, something's happening. Humped shape is rising out of the pit. Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods of barns, about 20 yards to my right.
Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, we are unable to continue the broadcast from Grover's Mill.
Obviously, Houseman had a passion for keeping radio dramas alive, as did Richard Toscan, Associate Dean of USC's School of Performing Arts, who worked alongside Houseman, who was the artistic director of the school at the time. The school's radio station, KUSC, was associated with NPR, which is how they came into the picture. Long story short, Toscan and Houseman were looking to adapt the work into a radio drama at the same time that NPR was attempting to broaden its audience.
The visuals were exciting and interesting and all of that, but I guess to me, I was even more fascinated by the sound effects and the use of music and everything, which seemed as innovative to me as anything that was done visually in the film.
Best of all, USC was coincidentally George Lucas's old school, meaning that he was more than happy to let them adapt his work. So happy, in fact, that multiple reports state that he sold the radio company the rights to adapt Star Wars for $1, along with music and sound effects. This partnership was also a no-brainer for Lucas, for the fact that he stated how much old radio shows and old sci-fi serials had been such an inspiration for him growing up.
Well, I grew up with radio. We didn't get a television until I was 10 years old, and radio dramas were very big then, and it had a very big influence on my life.
Now, there was also a financial incentive for NPR here as well, as in the 1980s, NPR was in a state of chaos, in debt to the tune of nearly $7 million. It's worth noting here that the debt was reported in 1983, 2 years after the original airing of the first radio drama. However, given the decline of the radio's popularity in general after the boom of TV, it's sensible to imagine that the idea of presenting one of the most popular media franchises of all time would be a huge plus for the company. Partnering with BBC to acquire more funding, the project was passed to a variety of producers and writers until it finally landed in the hands of director John Madden, not the football announcer,
you can have a barbecue on that head,
and Lucasfilm's own Carol Tiedemann as executive producers. When it came to a writer, Brian Daley was hired for the job. Daley had written some material for the then canon Star Wars expanded universe about Han Solo, so it was a no-brainer that he would be capable for the job. This decision was widely regarded as a good move, as Daley's charismatic writing and knowledge of the source material led to the eventual success of the project. The NPR article talks about the challenges of adapting a film that had about 30 minutes worth of dialogue total into a predominantly dialogue-heavy medium. That is the intrinsic irony of the whole project. Star Wars became a phenomenon due to its iconography and visuals on the screen. However, I would argue that this irony is also what makes the radio drama as a concept all the more interesting. This quote from Madden summarizes it perfectly. "We're making movies with the lights turned out," he says of a Star Wars experience. You know, movies to watch with your eyes closed. The story was eventually spliced into 13 digestible episodes, starring only a handful of the film's original cast. Mark Hamill reprised his role of Luke, as well as Anthony Daniels as C-3PO. As for the other main characters, they would be portrayed by actors who had previously auditioned for these roles, such as Perry King as Han Solo, or who had a vast experience of radio and video projects, like I don't know how to say her last name, Sax? I'm gonna go with Sax, who brought a ferocity to Princess Leia. While James Earl Jones would not be able to lend his iconic Darth Vader voice to the project, Brock Peters would do his own spin on the character. As one final piece of relevant information, besides acknowledging notable differences in storytelling between these radio dramas and films, in the 90s the scripts to these radio dramas were published as books, which, as you can imagine, were very helpful for researching this video. Not only do they help as an aid while listening, but as the foreword of the book explains, during the radio process, part of the recording is by making the script feel natural in its dialogue and pacing, meaning that there are parts of the script that never made it into the radio drama. These little tidbits, at the bare minimum, are interesting little pieces of story that are amusing to think about. However, as we will see, while rarely majorly significant to the important plot details, they often give insight into Daly and his writing style, and how much he really understood the source material. Similar to deleted scenes or extra features, sometimes what artists leave out of the finished products are just as compelling as what makes the final cut. So needless to say, I will be using these books as a huge source of information and reference points. While I find the backstory and creation of these to be interesting because I am a nerd, the purpose of this video is to discuss some of the key differences between this version and the story and how it plays out on screen, as well as figuring out what this medium adds to the story. Hopefully, by doing this, it's possible to come to a broader conclusion about the various pieces of art that we engage with, and think about why each of these things are presented in the ways that they are, or why we prefer a specific version of the story, or maybe even just a specific medium as a whole. So as we continue delving into the story through this video and other videos as well, we'll begin to dive into the actual content of these radio plays and their scripts, as well as continue to discuss production history, critical reception, and any other relevant events in relation to them, as there are some interesting twists and turns to these strange artifacts of Star Wars history. With all of that out of the way, let's dig into the first of the radio dramas.
Star Wars, based on characters and situations created by George Lucas.
March 2nd, 1981. The first episode of the radio adaptation of Star Wars airs on NPR, continuing until May 25th. What we will do now is go through the entire drama chapter by chapter and point out any major changes from the film, as well as any notable moments or ideas in the drama. I will be using the scripts as well as my own annotations while going through them as reference point. The first thing of note about the radio drama is that approximately the first hour or so is all completely original, taking place before when the film starts. We start with Luke on the moisture farm, listening to an advertisement about joining the Space Academy. This chapter introduces a full cast of new characters, as we learn about Luke and his group of friends on Tatooine, who also have an interest in speeders and working on vehicles.
Hey everybody! Where's the party?
Wherever I am, Luke. Right, Cammy?
Correct, lover.
Hey boys, guess what Skywalker was doing? Hey. Sitting in the Tech Dome playing an Academy recruitment tape. Not.
Fixer, Deke, Windy, and Cammy are amongst these characters. The chapter develops the friendship between Luke and his good friend Biggs, a character who has very little screen time in the film. Luke misses Biggs, who has joined the Academy and wants to follow in his friend's footsteps. This is the first example of many instances in which Daly uses deleted scenes or ideas from the film that were scrapped in order to expand the universe. Another example of this here is when Luke uses the Treadwell droid, which was featured in a different deleted scene. Luke and Fixer race their skyhoppers, and the radio drama does a bit more to develop Luke as an energetic, adventure-hungry kid. Biggs returns near the end of the chapter and is more or less established as the leader of the group that maintains order. They take a trip over to Beggar's Canyon, a place that's only mentioned in the film, and of course would later be fully developed in the prequels. Something interesting to note in this version is what elements of the expanded universe were already being, well, expanded. I think the fact that so much of what Daly writes here would end up becoming even more relevant to the franchise later on just shows how competent of a writer he was and how he truly understood the source material. Biggs tries to remind Luke that he's meant for bigger things than a life on Tatooine, but while Luke knows he can't afford to join the Academy, he takes offense to this. At one point, the script calls for Luke to say one of many iconic Star Wars lines.
I got a bad feeling about this.
I have a bad feeling about this.
I have a bad feeling about this.
But in the audio, he doesn't say it. Maybe Daly knew that it'd be better to save until a later moment, or maybe he just got lost in the speedy and rigorous recording process. It's noteworthy to mention here that the recording of this drama went exceptionally fast, often recording more than one episode a day. Therefore, when following along in the script, it's hard to know what lines were intentionally left out due to a carefully crafted creative or logistic decision, or what was simply lost in the improvisational and conversational style of this kind of recording, or what was simply forgotten and not worth going back for. So, we cannot take every absence of lines to be an artistic choice. However, as with all art, the room for interpretation can add a layer of meaning to a seemingly inconsequential moment. Overall, the chapter does a very nice job of giving Luke a bit more depth. It shows that even amongst the riffraff on Tatooine, he's the poorest amongst them. It illustrates his friendship with Biggs, which is major for setting the plot into motion in this version. It goes without saying that the episodic series, whether on television or radio, generally do a better job of developing characters, given the pure nature of them being longer, with more time to spend with each moving part of the story. That being said, I do think that the chapter puts into perspective how efficient the original film is at accomplishing more or less the same goal in much less time. This doesn't necessarily mean that either way is better or worse than the other, but again, it illustrates the meaningful decisions that writers and directors must take to enhance whatever project they're working on in their own respective mediums.
This is the Princess Leia Organa. Who's responsible for this outrage?
A delight to hear your voice again, Your Highness.
The second chapter introduces some new characters as well, while shifting focus over to Leia and what happens to her in the events leading up to how the film begins. Leia is introduced much earlier in the story in this version, which makes for what I think to be some good and also some not so good changes. Also, they say tant de vivre in this version. The chapter starts with some political back and forth, which honestly kind of reminds me of the direction the prequels would take. One thing that this does do is make Leia's job as a senator more clear and understood. This is until the ship is boarded by Vader, who has his first interaction with Leia, which pretty much serves to set up the power dynamic that Vader, and by proxy the Empire, holds early into the radio drama. They can board any ship at any time and do whatever they want. As we expect, Leia's whole backstory and situation is much more fleshed out here as well. Leia is being set up to marry a character named Lord Tion, which of course she does not want to do, but she uses this situation to her benefit, which gives her much more agency than she starts off with in the film. It's impossible to talk about this chapter without discussing something I have seen, Rogue One. Rogue One is a spin-off film that's primarily focused on the backstory of how Leia Organa received the plans to the Death Star, as well as why the Death Star was designed with a weak spot. The idea was apparently so hard for fans to understand and needed to be told so desperately that an entire film, story, and characters were created to explain all of this. Rogue One has kind of a complicated legacy. When it was first released in 2016, it was something different and exciting for Star Wars. People were hungry for more of the expanding universe, especially after the decision to uncanonize multiple stories and events, such as these radio dramas, by Disney in 2012. And the idea of gleaning an official explanation of events leading up to A New Hope was a cool idea. However, as time has gone on, the film has been met with a lot of skepticism and negativity, mostly that it doesn't really serve much of a purpose. As mentioned, Star Wars was based on the adventure serials of old radio, and there is a certain suspension of disbelief that viewers can accept while going into the story. A lot of people can just accept that a princess was able to come across the plans in some way, and that the builders accidentally left a weak point because they're bad and dumb. Whether or not you feel this way about Rogue One, what this radio drama offered was the same idea for a backstory without having to dedicate an entire chapter to the story.
Your Highness, I must speak to you.
He's been shot.
Are you all right?
Let's sit him up. Oh.
We have to summon a medic from the Tantive.
No time. That attack, a diversion so I could get through to you.
Why?
Information. I absorbed it under hypnotic imprint.
Stored in his brain. What information?
In the radio drama, before Vader boards the ship, a rebel who's been shot pleads to speak with the princess about information that he apparently absorbed under hypnotic imprint. Leia brings him to her home planet, and there he reveals that he knows about the Death Star. Later on in the chapter, Bail Organa is able to use this information, as well as information given to them by the Lord Tion character, to lead the rebels into a mission to retrieve the plan. They win, and the rebels now have the plans to the Death Star. I think that this works as a sensible explanation as to how the rebels retrieve the Death Star plans. However, I think that this version of events works in more ways than one. After Leia brings the hypnotized rebel home, her and her father stage a dinner party with Tion and try to get more information. He believes that Leia is in love with him, and in an act of trust, reveals that he is working with the Empire and he knows about their quote-unquote battle station. In the scene, Leia accidentally refers to it as the Death Star, which sets off alarm bells for Tion. When Tion gets up from dinner to alert the Empire, Leia attempts to stop him and in the tussle, kills him with his own blaster.
Leia!
We can't let him do this, Father.
I will ask you one more... Let me go. Traitor!
No!
Stop, Leia!
No!
Let me go! I warn you!
His blaster! Help me!
Release
Help!
Remember when Star Wars was concerned about if Han or Greedo shot first? Anyway, I believe that this backstory not only provides a sufficient explanation for how Leia receives the Death Star plans, but also serves to develop her as a competent, capable leader who's willing to protect herself for what she believes is right. A far cry from the kidnapped princess we meet at the beginning of A New Hope. At the end of the day, comparing this adaptation of A New Hope to a movie that came out in 2016 isn't really fair. However, I do find it bizarre that the whole discourse around Rogue One was, Finally, after all these years, we can really understand how the rebels got these plans, when a sensible explanation had existed as early as 1981. As another side note before we go into Chapter 3, I do think there is something to be said about the efficiency of film for storytelling versus a radio drama. This is a given, however, if you've watched a boring film before, you know that not every filmmaker can use the medium to their advantage. Within the first minute of Star Wars the film, the composition of the shot makes it abundantly clear that the Empire is large, strong, and powerful before any dialogue is even spoken. Of course, a radio drama works opposite to this, as it can really only demonstrate the Empire's power through dialogue, whether that's what characters say about the Empire or how the Empire acts and speaks. This is neither here nor there, but again, this comparison makes you appreciate both styles, a style in which so much can be communicated in so little time, and another in which creatives had to put a lot of thought into what is said, when it's said, and how it's said.
Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope.
We start off Chapter 3 with a familiar voice, as Anthony Daniels returns to voice C-3PO, or as the script refers to him as 3PO. Something I wasn't aware of before reading this script is that Daniels actually had a lot of experience acting in radio dramas before, so I'm sure he was in his comfort zone to return to the medium.
I actually feel it's one of the most creative mediums there is, because it works in the mind. The problem with film is that it's very much what the director and the cameraman have chosen for you to see. In radio, you can sit there and you can make the scenery how you want it.
As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, all of Ben Burtt and Lucasfilm sound effects were given to NPR to use, which helps in the case of R2-D2 as well.
I feel the successful soundtrack in a motion picture is one which goes unnoticed. That is, the average person attends the film, and they never doubt the fact that those objects and places in the film were just mic'd there on the set. I go around with a tape recorder. I record things in my apartment or in houses or on street corners or in factories. R2 is a combination of both. He has an electronic side to his personality, that is his voice, and he has an organic side. And the electronic sound originates with a synthesizer. The other half of R2's character is organic. There's sounds of little water pipes being twisted and blowing through whistles and various things of that sort. And
in fact, these sound effects and John Williams' score would do a lot of heavy lifting in this chapter in general, which is very action-packed and serves to tie Leia and Luke's stories together. Also, as a side note about R2-D2, all of his beeps and boops are written in the script almost like dialogue. I'm not sure if they considered this as a reference when they were adding his sound effects during post-production, but it's very funny to me nonetheless. Also, 3PO is kind of mean in this version. Like, he's a lot more critical and hateful towards R2-D2. Like, he's kind of rude in the film as well, and this is probably just done to be comedic, but it's strange. The main purpose of this chapter is to begin to link the radio drama to the movie. There's a neat little reference to this in the first chapter, as Luke notices some ships shooting each other above Tatooine and tells his friends who don't believe him. In this chapter, Leia is making her way towards Tatooine until her ship's attacked and eventually boarded, right above the planet. This is the situation that Luke was looking at in Chapter 1. About an hour into the radio drama, we finally get to where the film begins, as Vader boards the Tantive. In these cases, Daly more or less follows the script of the film while making minor changes along the way. For example, there's an instance where Vader force chokes Antilles. If this is how you are experiencing Star Wars for the first time, you may think he's just choking him with his hands. The drama attempts to make this clear. Again, this is one of many restrictions of adapting a story that doesn't take place in reality. Much of the dialogue in this iconic scene remains unchanged. However, this leads me to one major change between these two versions of the story that I prefer in the film. Essentially, there's a trade-off for developing Leia and giving her so much time before the action of the story begins. And that trade-off is a more compelling and interesting start for Luke and his journey. In the film, the viewer is going on a similar journey to Luke, in the sense that they too are being introduced to a brand new world with various questions and concerns. When Luke accidentally stumbles upon Princess Leia's message to Obi-Wan, this is the audience's introduction to Leia as well. We too are wondering, who is this? What does this mean? Who is Obi-Wan? What's going on? Well, in the radio drama, all these questions are answered for us before they're answered for Luke. We know who the princess is. We know about the Death Star and why it's so important for her to talk to Obi-Wan. We don't know exactly who Obi-Wan is, but we know he's a Jedi who lives on Tatooine. We even know the entire contents of her message to Obi-Wan because we listened to her record it. I believe that knowing all this information was probably essential to telling the story in this episodic medium. However, I think it makes for a less adventurous feeling and overall less effective intro. Now we know too much. And instead of experiencing what Luke is experiencing in the next chapter, we get to watch him find out information that we already know, which kind of makes for a repetitive story. I think an easy solution here could have just been to reorder the episodes a little bit. Maybe the first 2 or 3 episodes set up Luke as he meets R2-D2, C-3PO, and Obi-Wan, and the audience gets a familiar feeling of questions and adventure. Then the narrator at the beginning could explain that while all this is happening on Tatooine, these were the events leading up to this, and continue the story of episode 2 of the radio drama of Leia, and the whole operation of getting the plans. Then the story could just continue with Luke until he eventually saves Leia. That's just my opinion, and at the end of the day, it's a minor gripe. All the story elements are still there, but what we can get out of this is that in whatever medium, it's not just the actual contents of your story that make it good, but it's how the content is delivered, and the process of the audience coming to understand what's happening. 3PO and R2 fall on Tatooine in an escape pod, and Vader kidnaps Leia. One final thing to note about this chapter is the use of the word Sith. Although mentioned in the film's rough cut, but not in the final movie, the first use of the word actually comes in the novelization of A New Hope. This again proves that Daly wasn't simply watching the film and adapting what he saw, but drawing from all sorts of supplementary material as well.
Can those be children? What strange robes! I can't see under their hoods except their glowing eyes. How eerie.
Chapter 4 takes us back down to Tatooine with Luke, as 3PO and R2 have landed. The pair split ways, and then 3PO meets the Jawas, where once again, the Jawas need to be described by somebody for the audience to understand what they are. However, the use of the original sound effects helps to clarify these little creatures. As a side note, throughout the entire script there are these sketches of various landscapes, scenes, vehicles, and people. For the life of me, I could not figure out where these come from or who drew them. It wasn't listed in the book anywhere or anywhere I could find online. So if you're watching this and you do have access to this information, please let me know. As we return to Luke, we pick up about the same place in the film, as Luke is trying to convince his uncle to get some extra joy so he can leave and join the academy. Much of the dialogue for this scene, as well as when they buy R2 and 3PO off the Jawas, is more or less unchanged from the film. This takes us to when Luke finds Leia's holograph inside of R2, which I've already explained my opinion on. We then get the scene where Luke asks his uncle to join the academy, and in this scene, there's one minor change that I do like and one that I don't. I do like the fact that earlier in the drama, we get a similar scene of Luke asking his uncle to get some new droids, and his uncle telling him to quit daydreaming and that they can't afford it. Now, they have new droids, and his uncle repeats the same thing. I like this small addition because it shows that no matter what Luke says or does, Uncle Owen will always find an excuse to keep him. It really emphasizes the cyclical nature of his life and why he longs to escape so badly. The one minor change I don't like is this exchange. This is a small gripe, but I like the simple exchange in reference to Vader in the movie without being so on the nose.
Luke's just not a farmer, Owen. He has too much of his father in him.
That's what I'm afraid of.
Obi-Wan Kenobi. Now there's a name I haven't heard in a long time.
In Chapter 5, we're introduced to Obi-Wan Kenobi. Early in the chapter, Luke recounts a memory to 3PO about a strange interaction he once had with Ben Kenobi. This is a harmless change, but it illustrates the idea that Ben had previous contact with Luke as a means of checking on him, the idea of which would later be expanded in the EU, like in the show Kenobi. We then get the scene where Luke is attacked by Tusken Raiders, and Ben scares him off with that scream. I will say, the scene doesn't translate the best of radio in my opinion. It's hard to tell what's happening, who is where, and what these sounds are, especially if you weren't familiar with the film. I would assume the people behind this project figured that anyone listening would already be familiar with Star Wars, so maybe they didn't consider any new people tuning into this before seeing the film, which is a fair assumption to make. Two little notes about the infamous Ben Kenobi shriek is that 1, this version obviously uses the original sound effect before it was later altered upon other re-releases, so it's fun to hear that. And 2, from what I've gathered, this radio drama is the first time it was ever explained what the actual sound was supposed to be. Another funny thing I noticed is that when they all go back to Obi-Wan's house in the movie, C-3PO tells Luke he's going to shut down for a while to do some internal checks.
Like your father did.
Sir, if you'll not be needing me, I'll close down for a while.
Sure, go ahead.
This is clearly just to give Daniels a break, as 3PO is not needed for this scene, so they could have the empty costume sit in the back. I just find it funny they decided to keep this line in the radio drama, where 3PO could have just not been involved in the conversation, and I wouldn't have questioned it. A couple of lines I noticed in the script that didn't make it into the final product. One is Obi-Wan insinuating that Luke taking R2 and 3PO back to his home would lead to the deaths of Owen and Beru. Not much to say here, just thought it was an interesting line considering at this point they were probably already dead. Another bizarre line is Obi-Wan and 3PO lighting a funeral pyre to burn the bodies of the Jawas that were killed by Imperial troopers. The imagery of that is just so bizarre to me. However, they did manage to keep this line in, which is funny to me. Finally, at the end of this chapter, we get a trick that will be used a couple times throughout the radio drama, which makes sense, and that is major plot points or high action scenes happening what I will call off-screen, meaning that the character goes somewhere, experiences something, and comes back to relay what they saw to other characters. This is what happens as Luke tells Obi-Wan about his house being burned down and his aunt and uncle being killed. Of course, this doesn't hit quite as hard as seeing the burning house in the fire. And while I think a scene of Luke screaming and talking to himself may have been awkward, maybe a quick transition with some fire sound effects and Luke calling out to them and then screaming would have done the trick. Either way, this isn't a bad way to do it in this medium.
Over my dead body. Yeah, I'll bet.
As a bit of perspective, in Star Wars the movie, Obi-Wan and Luke arrive at Mos Eisley about 43 minutes into the 2-hour and 5-minute movie. When we arrive at this point in the radio drama, the drama has been longer than the entire movie. As the crew gets to Mos Eisley, we're treated to the iconic scene where Obi-Wan uses a mind trick to convince the guards to leave them alone. Maybe it's just me, but I do find that without the hand wave, the scene isn't the same. It still does a good job establishing that Obi-Wan can alter the mind, but it's so clear in the film what's going on, and it helps to illustrate how powerful he is. Another quick note is that there's a moment where Luke starts riddling off various creature names. Many of these creatures have gone on to be canonized and also uncanonized under new names. As Obi-Wan and Luke talk to various people in the cantina, the radio drama takes this opportunity to explain what exactly R2 and 3PO are doing when they're kicked out of the cantina for being droids. If the movie were to do this, it may take away some of the tension and atmosphere of the scene, but I think it works here, as due to the extended time period, audiences are willing to devote a bit more time to subplots like this. We meet Han and Chewbacca's lines are also written similarly to R2's. From the outset, it's clear that, much like the approach taken with 3PO, that Daly will take a grittier, more aggressive, and more rogue pirate-like approach to Han Solo, as he mocks Obi-Wan for his age and is very concerned about the pair being able to hold up their end of the deal. Also in the script, Solo says that he makes the Kessel Run in 12 time parts, but alas,
The Vulcan's the ship that made the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs.
The drama still says parsecs, which while consistent, is consistently wrong about a measurement of time. Solo agrees to take the group, and then comes his altercation with Greedo. A way in which viewers or listeners can get a similar experience from the scene is by watching the film with subtitles on or by following the script while listening. In both instances, Greedo speaks his own language, but through translation and text, it's possible to know what he's saying. I appreciate the fact that Daly writes his lines, even though they're never said. However, all that being said, I think the scene works better in both the film and radio version with not knowing exactly what's being said on the part of Greedo, and using Han's reactions to fill the gap with your own imagination. Most importantly about this scene, however, is that there's no question about who shot first, as Han even rubs it in further, again playing into the moral ambiguity of the story that modern-day Lucas and Disney seem scared to touch. The radio drama has Han being chased by characters named Preacher and Heater, who work for Jabba the Hutt. Jabba is only named in reference, never spoken to during the drama. This seems like it could have been an opportunity to expand on Jabba's presence and power, given how much of his appearance was cut from the original film. However, maybe Daly realized that too many scenes of strange languages with no guide to follow what was being said would be hard for a radio audience. He probably made the right call there.
Telling us about what a piece of junk!
She'll make 0.5 over light speed, kid.
What?
She's got the highest lift-mass ratio around.
In Chapter 7, Luke and Obi-Wan set out to sell Luke's land speeder to cover some of the costs of their trip in the Falcon. Obi-Wan abuses the Force to dupe an innocent dealer into giving them a deal they want on a speeder, and then he warns Luke about the consequences of abusing the Force. While this is humorous, this dichotomy of the Jedi is something that's intrigued fans forever, whether Star Wars writers meant to do this or not. This scene is reminiscent to when Qui-Gon Jinn tries to dupe Watto to get a deal in The Phantom Menace. The only reason that Qui-Gon can't do this is because Watto's species, Todarians, are immune to Jedi mind tricks. I don't think Lucas, Daly, or any other writer who has written anything in this franchise has intentionally tried to make the Jedi out to be hypocritical, maybe besides Rian Johnson. But while this scene was ironic, it's interesting that many years later, there's still a prevailing idea of Jedi picking and choosing when they should or shouldn't use the Force to benefit themselves. As mentioned in the previous chapter, this chapter takes a bit of time to develop Han and adds some urgency to his decision to leave Tatooine. The new character Heater catches up with Han to collect money from him on behalf of Jabba, and in the process, another character is mentioned.
If I'm disappointed again, it won't be any two for the credit twerp I'll put on your trail. Next time, I'll hire Boba Fett himself.
A few things are interesting about this. For one, the spelling of his name. But also, it's interesting to think that as early as 1981, Boba Fett had such a presence in the extended universe, showing up in an adaptation for a film he wasn't even in. Of course, by the time that this radio drama aired, Empire had already been released, so this was probably a smart reference for the fans who just wanted to hear his name again. The rest of the chapter plays out more or less the same as the movie, despite the lack of Jabba the Hutt as mentioned. Not a lot happens in this chapter plot-wise, but it does a good job of developing Han, and sets up the rest of the story off of Tatooine in a nice way.
Oh, please!
Pain. A universe of it. Your world is nothing but pain.
Make it stop!
Tell me what I wish to know.
Chapter 8 takes us back up to Leia and Vader, and features an iconic scene from the radio drama that I'd heard about before even listening to it. In this chapter, Daly expands on another deleted scene from the movie, in which Vader interrogates Leia through torture and a robot with a giant needle to inject her arm with truth serum. What makes this scene so iconic are both the performances of Brock Peters as Vader and Ann Sachs as Leia.
Tell me what I wish to know. Where are the plans?
I can't tell!
Your skin is afire.
Oh,
You're burning.
no!
Your nerve endings are in flames. Your flesh is being torn apart.
Make it stop! Please make it stop!
I will when you've told me where the plans are.
This scene is even mentioned in the NPR article about the dramas, and talks about the palpable energy and fear felt between cast members during the taping of this scene. This is an excellent use of the medium, as once again the opportunity is taken to expand on scenes from the film that didn't make the cut. A basic principle of horror is fear of the unknown, and this is one instance where the lack of visuals actually helps the story, as viewers use their own imagination to think about what this torture robot might look like, and the fear in Leia's eyes. Daly also uses this scene to do a bit of foreshadowing towards Vader being Luke and Leia's father. This is a neat bit of foreshadowing that won't be revealed in this drama, and will reward those who listen to the next one. No doubt, waiting until Empire had released to make this radio drama had some unforeseen positive benefits when it comes to telling the story. This chapter ends up being a pretty dark one overall, as after the interrogation sequence we get the first glimpse of the Death Star blowing up Alderaan. Peters and Sachs really steal the show during the whole chapter. It's worth noting here that even Sachs believes that these moments are translated so well through the radio drama by the work of Tom Vogelli, who, using John Williams' score and the aforementioned Ben Burt sound effects, is able to orchestrate the sound in a way that more or less paints a picture in the minds of listeners as to what's happening. It's no secret that sound has never been more important to the story of Star Wars.
See? Now from this basic position, you can launch into any movement of the blade. In attack or defense, advance or withdraw.
Chapter 9 is all about development. Developing Han as a reckless and seemingly selfish pirate, and further details about Luke's training with Obi-Wan during this time. Much like in the movie, we see Luke's first time using a lightsaber, with the same iconic sounds. Instead of jumping right into dodging sting bullets, Obi-Wan teaches Luke about the more spiritual side of wielding a lightsaber, going through various positions for defense and attack. The scene focuses on the flow of the Force, the natural way in which Jedi move positions to let the Force flow through them. The chapter also does a good job of reinforcing Luke's ambitious and excitable nature, as after doing a basic drill, he wants to spar with Obi-Wan. After this, we get a slightly extended version of the scene where Luke trains against the droid and learns to use the Force to block sting bullets. Overall, this entire sequence gives a bit more insight into Luke and Obi-Wan's relationship, the Jedi dogma, and the Force, all while developing them as characters as well. We then move into some dialogue where we learn about Han and Obi-Wan, as they argue about money and freedom. This scene not only emphasizes Han's preoccupation with money, but Obi-Wan's disconnection from it, as he reveals he hasn't owned any credits in years. I believe this scene is again supposed to illustrate Han as a greedy pirate, but also to show the dedication of the Jedi and their monkish nature. We also learn more about Han and Chewie's relationship, as multiple times throughout the drama, it'll be Chewie to ground Han and remind him of his morals and desire to help, which sometimes is clouded by his desire for money. The chapter does less to service the plot and more to develop the characters. However, it ends with Luke and Leia's stories finally coming together, as Luke and friends finally discover the Death Star and the Millennium Falcon gets caught in the Empire's tractor beam and they're forced to board the Star Destroyer.
3BO? C-3PO, do you copy?
Yes, Master Luke.
We've been cut off in the detention block. Is there any other way out of the cell bay?
Just those guards.
As a foil to the previous chapter, Chapter 10 is very action-based and very concerned with moving the plot forward. The action plays out more or less the same as the film. The sound design does a lot of heavy lifting here, and as mentioned, there's a certain art to attempting to adapt such a visually stimulating film like Star Wars into this medium, but the chapter manages to achieve this. I haven't yet spoken about the various levels of skill that I believe are important to making action work in radio format. Of course, the composition of sound goes a long way, but director John Madden discusses in the behind-the-scenes radio presentation about the making of the drama that he's very interested in getting a realistic performance out of the actors that, when combined with these sound effects, gives a certain weight of the universe to make it believable.
It got to be known in the recording sessions as effort. I would ask for a little bit of effort from somebody, which meant that when Luke was getting into a land speeder, he would say, "Come on, 3PO, it's about time we got on the way here." So that the effort would be in the voice. And if that component is actually in the voice, when you add the sound of that happening, it will immediately read as that happening. Now, that's something...
Not to mention Daly's task of having to write scenes that would translate in some way to radio once all the moving parts are put together. So, while you may have a preference for the film and its illustrations of adventure and action, there's an undeniable care and certain challenge in directing a radio drama, where collaboration becomes even more integral to the success of the art. The entire chapter consists of the gang infiltrating the Empire ship, hiding to avoid guards, saving Leia, and the gang jumping down into the garbage chute. One neat choice in this chapter is to end right as the walls are closing and there doesn't seem to be a way out. One benefit that this episodic nature has over the film is the ability to create tension and drama in instances like this. This choice also harkens back to the old radio dramas that this project were inspired by, leaving the story on a cliffhanger to keep the audience coming back for more. This is a small touch, but a welcome one, and a positive use of the medium in my opinion.
Chewie, punch in the jump to light speed. We made it!
Chapter 11 begins to close in on the final 3 chapters of the drama. Something I found impressive about the chapter is the drama's ability to communicate the various events that are going on, as this chapter sees Luke and friends going in a variety of different directions. The episode doesn't immediately begin with the cliffhanger, but instead illustrates what's happening aboard the ship during the fiasco through the lens of Vader and Tarkin, and then R2 and 3PO. This is another action-based episode that focuses on the gang escaping the ship. Of course, R2 and 3PO save them from the trash compactor and make their way to the Falcon. During this time, Han and Chewie get split up from Luke and Leia, and Han has this interaction with Chewie. Once again, Chewie acts as the angel on Han's shoulder, and this dynamic will continue more or less to the end, and was no doubt inspired by Daly's own treatment of the character in the spin-off novels he wrote about Han himself. As the gang all meet up by the Falcon, the scene finally comes to what's been brewing the entire story, the confrontation between Obi-Wan and Vader. Obi-Wan's death, of course, doesn't translate the same way in this medium. Much like the lack of seeing Obi-Wan's hand wave during the mind trick or Vader's force choke, not being able to see Obi-Wan give up nor see him vanish don't completely illustrate to the audience the flow of the Force that other dialogue in this adaptation achieves successfully. Daly knows this, so he adds in references to Obi-Wan's robes being empty to signify becoming one with the Force, as well as Luke noting how Obi-Wan let himself get cut down. The imagery in the film during this moment serves the greater theme of the story better in my opinion. Once again, the addition of extra lines by Daly shows the consideration that must be taken in order to incorporate not only action and story elements, but thematic elements as well. The chapter ends with Han and Luke fighting off some TIE fighters, and in a clever nod to Luke's earlier training, Han reminds him to rely on the computer sensors less and eyeball it once in a while. This works, much like when Luke lets the Force work through him when training with his lightsaber. This link to intuition serves all in the galaxy well, pirates and Jedi alike.
What about you? You and Chewbacca and the Millennium Falcon could make all the difference. Han, you're...
The penultimate episode of the radio drama serves to tie up some loose ends from previous chapters, as well as set up the rebel plan to destroy the Death Star, which will act as the finale of the story. The gang escapes the ship and makes way to a hidden rebel base on Yavin 4, all while Vader and Tarkin take action to use the Death Star on the planet. As mentioned, at this point in the story in the film, Han mentions he's leaving with his reward, but in this version, Daly expands on this, explaining that not only is Han leaving, but he's leaving with the last of a very important material that rebels need, making Han even more heinous in this instance. Side note, there's a funny typo in the script when Han says fighter bays.
A person can definitely fit through that window. A small person, an attack child.
Finally, as in the movie, Luke is reunited with Biggs. This reunion carries a bit more weight in this version, as more time is spent on the friendship between Biggs and Luke at the beginning here, and it's clearly identified that Biggs is one of Luke's main inspirations for wanting to leave Tatooine. However, Biggs' inclusion here does bring a change that I do find to be unnecessary. After they reunite, Biggs takes Luke aside and gets him to practice flying an X-Wing in a full combat simulation. This is okay? I guess it's harmless in the grand scheme of things. However, I always found the whole idea of Luke being a great pilot was a combination of his previous experience on Tatooine, experience that the radio drama even further develops in the movie, and his newfound relationship to the Force, using his own intuition at the crucial hour. I'm sure this edition was only made to round out the episode and spend a bit more time with Biggs, but to me, in a small way, it implies that Luke needed extra training to be a good pilot, which clashes with the final scene in my opinion. Either way, it happens. The Rebels get the lowdown on the Death Star plans, Luke gets ready to fly out with R2-D2, Leia stays behind at the Rebel base, and Han Solo goes his own way. And thus, the final chapter of the story is at hand. The beginning of the final chapter takes us back to the Empire, and something that I haven't pointed out yet, but that this version of the story insists on, is the true power and authority of General Tarkin. The film displays Tarkin as a force within the Empire, but it's obvious that the emphasis is on Vader. This version balances both of these characters, as a short conversation between Mahdi and Tarkin early in the chapter implies that if given the opportunity, Tarkin would commit treason against the Empire to command full power. Not only does this illustrate the corrupt nature of those in power within the Empire, who are only relegated to themselves and not their cause, nor their emperor, it also breaks down the power dynamic, as Mahdi and Tarkin don't believe Vader to be a real threat, and don't believe his connection to the Force to be truly dangerous. It is strange to see Vader during this era of Star Wars as emasculated. It adds an interesting wrinkle to the story, but before we take off, the reason for 3PO's more hostile nature becomes revealed. Daly wants to give him a bit more of a character arc. After spending the entire radio drama rudely discounting R2-D2, they have this exchange. While this is similar to the movie, it lands with a bit more impact in this version, further humanizing the droids and showing a sweeter side of 3PO. Similarly to what we've discussed in the scene where Luke discovers his aunt and uncle being murdered off screen, the first half of the Rebel mission takes place through the perspective of Leia, as she gleans information from the Rebels' communicators and stays back at the base. For a chapter so heavily focused on vehicle movement and visual storytelling, Daly understands that the best way to create tension is to place the viewer in a similar state to Leia, away from the fight not knowing what's really going on. I think this is a clever move and a thoughtful use of the auditory medium. The second half of the scene takes place in space. Actions play out as they do in the movie, as Gold Team doesn't manage to hit the target, leaving Luke, Biggs, and Wedge as the final straw. This pairs well with the beginning of the radio drama, and they even reference it here as well. Luke says this in the movie too, but now we have a better understanding of what that means. Just as in the movie, Vader attacks on his own ship, and just when all seems to be lost, Solo returns to help Luke. So again, the nasty character traits of Han, just like 3PO, are used to cement their character arc and illustrate their true nature. Luke listens as he hears Obi-Wan's voice in his head and turns off his sensors. I find this to be very noteworthy, because it emphasized the common ground that Obi-Wan and Han actually have. It's a neat little reference to the story. Anyways, Luke obviously hits the target and blows up the Death Star, which is about as cool as the radio adaptation can make it, and returns back to the base to celebrate. The gang reunites and 3PO is very concerned with R2's health and safety, which is cute. Then, to end the story, we get a comedic alternative viewpoint of the ceremony that Leia holds to honor the crew, as Han and Chewie have no idea how to react to this kind of pageantry. Finally, the last lines of the drama reference the fact that, as mentioned, The Empire Strikes Back had been released. Adding this alternative point of view was another way in which Daly used this opportunity to add some humor and take the audience inside the scene rather than outside. The final notes here could be Daly excitedly expressing his desire to continue the saga in this radio format, which we know would eventually happen. Overall, a charming, optimistic, and fitting end to this detailed and descriptive version of events. The end. Thanks for listening. Take it easy. But wait, we just spent all this time going through each of the various episodes of the Star Wars radio drama, but why? What about what we said at the beginning about all this? That the purpose of the video was to think about the ways we consume media and why stories are presented a certain way? Well, what can we take away from the radio drama? This goes without saying for a lot of viewers, I'm sure, but one common theme when comparing Star Wars the movie versus the radio drama is the art of subtlety in filmmaking and what that can bring to a story. Filmmakers can create meaning in such small ways. The way an actor's face reacts or doesn't react to a piece of information, a hidden message or detail in the background, a quick hand movement, and so on. The radio drama doesn't have that luxury. Not only does it have an entire sense to its detriment, but the episodic format requires reminders, recaps, and reinforcements to keep the audience aware, or bring new audience members up to speed. Film just doesn't share this problem. Calling Star Wars the movie subtle will be like calling YouTube thumbnails high art. However, filmmaking innately carries a subtlety that filmmakers can use, and depending on if you value that, you may see this as a benefit to film versus radio. This lack of subtlety can actually be a positive for radio in the next category. A bad film doesn't use the medium of film to its advantage. This is a given. Flat and boring shots, a camera without purpose, a lack of meaningful music use, poor direction or performances. These and many more things are qualities of a bad film. On the flip side, due to the very nature of the radio format, radio dramas have a lot less of these variables to worry about, which allows for more thought to be given into elements like dialogue, direction, performances, music, and sound. Film has the luxury of just showing an establishing shot, like a shot of a ship, to establish time and place. Radio must thoughtfully craft how this information is presented to the audience. Will the actor remark on the location? Will the sound effects be enough? Is a narration required? This means that those making radio performances have to work harder to transmit information, making for an added layer of thoughtfulness given to the entire project. This is not to say that a film is innately lazier or easier than radio, just that film offers an added bonus of quickly establishing information that radio doesn't, which lends itself well to radio, to be able to carefully craft its story through sound. In this same vein, a major difference of film and radio is the goal of the project. I believe the goal of any good narrative film, no matter the subject, should be to show, not tell. For example, don't have the characters tell me about some crazy adventure they had, show me the crazy adventure. This is a careful balancing act that I do believe Star Wars the movie does well, telling lore and backstory when necessary, but also bringing the viewer into the story through creative and engaging action sequences. In a radio drama, showing is not an option, so the goal of the radio drama becomes how well can we tell the story. Of course, there are action sequences and heavy use of music and sound effects to bring listeners into these moments. However, as we have mentioned, some of the most intense moments happen off-screen, and it's up to the auditory elements, the dialogue or music, to recount what's happening or has just happened. It's safe to say that comparing a radio program to a film is just a useless exercise anyways, as the goals of each project are entirely different. The purpose of this video is not to compare them and say which is better, just to further understand how various mediums can be used in their own respective ways to tell a story. You may have a preference for either or, and that's okay. I just think that in the current day and age, as attention spans are on the decline, it's important to remind ourselves of different ways to engage the brain besides the quick burst multi-screen snippets we're becoming more used to. Another major element that's specific to the radio drama that I think makes it more important than just an adaptation of Star Wars is its use as a tool for accessibility. Not every Star Wars fan is blessed with the ability to use every sense to engage with the content. Of course, a major component to Star Wars fandom is its universe building, its design, its iconography. If you're able to see these things, think to yourself, how would not being able to see impact my connection to Star Wars? In this way, the radio drama becomes a much more immersive and meaningful experience than watching the film with descriptive audio. Those with visual impairments can engage with radio drama and get as much out of it as any fan of Star Wars, and the decision to release the scripts of them just furthers the scope of accessibility. I don't have an impairment such as this, but I've worked closely with various people with disabilities. A common concern that they share is when an activity or piece of media is lessened or negatively impacted in order to accommodate for their disability, rather than a universal design surrounding said activity. Instead of offering an overdub of somebody describing everything that's happening on a screen, the radio drama incorporates these descriptions in its text, and what it doesn't offer in its text, it offers in sound effects to create the world. I think that's more valuable than simply being a way to experience Star Wars. For some, it may be the way. With all of these differences that are evident between film and radio, one thing that's abundantly clear is that the main element of any work that makes it great, that makes it connect with audiences and gain any sort of following or legacy, is passion. If you know anything about the production of the film Star Wars, you know that Lucas and his talented team at ILM faced numerous challenges in making the film, but their passion drove them to work through this. This is similar to the people behind the radio drama as well. Toscan and NPR for their respective passions and keeping radio alive, John Madden for his passion to dramatize the project and adapting it to the best of his ability, the passion of sound effect artists like Ben Burt, who describe filming various random things around their house and thinking how they can turn it into sci-fi sounds, passionate performances such as Perry King, Brock Peters, Ant Sachs, or Mark Hamill and Anthony Daniels, who had very little financial reason to reprise their roles, but did so for a love of their characters. And perhaps, as described by people who worked on the project, the passion of Brian Daley, who used his own experience in writing in the Star Wars universe to really understand the universe, and adapted about 2 hours of film into over 6 hours of meaningful content, bringing the story to an entirely new audience. I hesitate to say any more about Daley here, because as we continue into this journey and delve into the eventual adaptation of The Empire Strikes Back, as well as the troubled history of the final installment, Return of the Jedi, his story and contributions to the project will become clear. So let it be known, I keep my comments about Daley here brief, not because there's little to say, but rather too much. So, I hope you enjoyed this discussion of the Star Wars radio drama. Up next, we'll take a dive into the context surrounding Empire. We'll spend more time in the next episode discussing how important story beats are handled in both mediums, and how the cast and crew were tasked with adapting, at the time, arguably the most popular and iconic movie in the zeitgeist. For now, take it easy, and live long and prosper.